All right, hello, and welcome to another episode of Book Faces Live, the show where we talk to the faces behind your books. I'm Nathan Van Coops, and today I am very excited to bring back a repeat guest, Chris Fox. Welcome back to the show, Chris.
Hey, thanks for having me, Nathan. It's good to see you.
Chris was on in a previous episode. We were chatting a little bit about his nonfiction series, the Write Faster, Write Smarter series, and I am currently in the middle of enjoying his most recent offering in that series, Plot Gardening. So Chris has graciously come on the show to tell us a little bit more about his book, and we're going to talk a little bit about plotting and structure and cool stuff like that. So, Chris, can you first off, thank you so much for being here, and then could you tell people a little bit about Plot Gardening and what this book is all about?
Sure. So I was trying to come up with a hybrid approach between pantsing, writing by the seat of your pants, and plotting, because what I've kind of found over the last few years is, while I do really enjoy story structure and I want to be able to outline things meticulously, and I do write faster books when I'm doing that, I kind of took a little bit too far, and I felt like it was squeezing some of the creativity out of it. And so I wanted to come back to a process that kind of rewarded my creativity, but also still let me use the story structures that I'd sort of come to learn over the last few years.
Interesting. And you came up with the metaphor of gardening, and you've kind of tied this into this story in the details and in your chapter headings and things like that. What for you made the connection there, or why did you kind of choose that metaphor as your way of structuring this book?
So the most hated pantser in the world, I think, at this point is George R. R. Martin. George R. R. Martin, he was being razzed in a university lecture by Brandon Sanderson. Brandon Sanderson was saying, essentially, that George R. R. Martin is a gardener, and he just sort of waits around to see sort of what springs up in his garden, and that he was an architect. So he would actually, architect the entire structure of his story and make sure it was all laid out, and then he could sit down and write it.
Yeah.
And I realized that makes it a very binary equation, that it's either you're a gardener or you're, sort of a plotter architect. And that felt wrong to me. And so when I decided to do this analogy, I'm like, well, it's really kind of both. So I'm going to borrow from that analogy, and everything that I'm going to do is going to have to do with gardening. So I liken it to, if you've got a garden and that's what your book is going to be, the soil is your world building, and all of the information you're kind of gradually putting in there about the characters in the world and cool little events that you're thinking of. The seeds are the main characters, the point of view characters that are going to be a part of your story. And then if you think of the outline as sort of like a guide pole, how plants will grow up along the plant in the garden, that's sort of how it all plays together. So you still got that creativity of, you're going to put your characters in this garden, and you don't know what they're going to look like when they start springing up out of that soil. But you have some ideas about the direction they're going to go, and that's sort of what your outline does. So I like that analogy made it really easy for me to keep both the creative side and the organized side in such a way that people can relate to it.
I'm sure there's a lot of ways you can go into that analogy and have it work, just because gardening is a lot of work. There's a lot of ways for it to go wrong too, and as I'm sure you kind of mine that analogy for a lot. And I've been enjoying the way you've been approaching it in the book.
I've gotten some pretty amusing anecdotes from readers, because I'm not a gardener myself. I've only gardened once or twice in my life, and I've gotten a few things wrong apparently about gardening. So gardeners have let me know that there's more work involved even than what I said.
Yeah, no, I believe it. I've had some poor luck with gardening in my life, so I can relate to that. So you talked about, one of the first things you mentioned here was world building, and I think that's something that you do incredibly well. We had a quick comment. Dave says, "Please tell me if that's a Firefly T-shirt." What does it say?
This is the shirt.
I can't see the butt flop.
Curse your sudden but inevitable betrayal. The very first episode of Firefly, where Wash, the pilot, is playing with toy dinosaurs.
Yeah.
And the shirt, which Lisa bought me, by the way, is from Firefly.
That's an excellent wife gift. She understands you well.
She does.
But okay, so tangent from Dave, but well deserved. Can we? So yeah, talk to us a little bit more about world building. So like I said, you are someone who creates very imaginative, very complex worlds, and this is kind of your bread and butter a little bit with your fiction. So can you tell us a little bit about what you mean by laying this soil of world building and how you go about doing that.
Yeah, so I have an unfair advantage in that as a kid, I was introduced at a very young age to Dungeons and Dragons, and so what you're doing in all of these game sessions when you're playing with your friends is you're creating a shared world where each of you is contributing to this experience, and then in your free time, you're kind of thinking about this world and trying to imagine what it would be like to live there, and what the people who live there are like, and what the customs are like. And so as I grew up, I continued to kind of refine how I do that. So I'm always asking myself why. I watch a ton of documentaries because I want to know how stuff works. And that's the essence of world building, is simply understanding what the world that you're writing is and what differentiates it from other worlds. And it's not necessarily just science fiction and fantasy where you have spaceships or a particular type of magic. If you're writing romance and you have a very specific locale that you know better than anybody else, maybe that's the Alaskan wilderness, which you wouldn't even think of as being a good romantic spot, but you in some way are able to bring that to life because you know it better than anybody else. That kind of world building really strengthens the backbone of the story, I think, in any genre.
What are some ways you see people getting world building wrong, or like forgetting that step and then trying to create a story? What kind of problems do you see if people don't lay that foundation first?
This comes back to my teenage years in D&D. And one of the things that I learned when I was the game master, the person that was running these games, you let your players decide what decisions they're going to make, and so they'll do things you would never in a million years expect. And it taught me to think differently. And really, what I learned is that someone is going to exploit this to its logical conclusion. So if you create an ability in a setting, you had better understand what the economic ramifications would be. So, for example, if there's a magic in your world that lets you turn invisible and or walk through walls, then one of the first things that people are going to do is rob banks.
Right.
So if you're a bank, then you're going to need magical security. So all of a sudden now you've got magical security firms, which is going to lead to magical collection agencies and all sorts of outgrowth. So you as a kind of a creator need to look at whatever piece you add into your setting. What are the long-term ramifications of that to the whole setting?
One of the things that I enjoy about the introduction to your book that I was reading so far was you get into, when you talk about this world building a little bit, you introduce the idea of how much thought goes into your worlds, and sometimes that you may have this idea, but you may put it aside for a little while and just sort of let it percolate. And I think some people have the misconception that when you just sit down to write, you just sit down and blank page and stuff just flows. But I was happy to find that in your book you address the fact that sometimes you need to take some time to really think this stuff out. And how important is that to you, like your thought process before you even ever start writing, how much you spend time in this world mentally?
Even now, I've got 16 novels in print and like 29 books total across a whole bunch of different genres. I still need a long time to get a book right. So the example that I use in Thought Gardening is called The Dark Lord Bert. And I have a video series about this character and about sort of how I brainstormed it. And the first video went up 5 months ago, and the series isn't done. So I'll probably be creating 1 or 2 more videos. And so you sort of get to see organically, it takes me 6-7 months to figure out all these ideas, and I haven't sat down really to write word 1 of the story yet. So the time that I spend percolating and thinking about it, I mean, that is really, really important, and it's why I think we all have at least one friend who said for the last 20 years, I'm writing a book. The reason they're not sitting down to finish writing their book is they're still in that world-building phase and are still trying to assemble kind of all that information, and I do think it's critical.
Yeah, it is. I can't be taken too far. I know my first book took me 4 years to write, and a lot of that was just me sitting thinking or just letting it wander around in my head. We had a comment from Kay that says, Chris is difficult to hear. I'm not sure if everyone's experiencing that difficulty, but I don't know if there's any microphone issues on your end. But I can hear you fine, so I don't know if anyone else is having that issue. But if they are, please comment. And I'm sorry, Kay, if you're having difficulty with the audio, but we'll speak up. So you talk about your world building, and obviously, you said the seeds to this process are your characters. Can you talk a little bit about? Sean says also very quiet, so I'm not sure what's going on there. But anyway, can you talk a little bit about the seeds?
Let's headset off and seeing if that's any better. Can you guys hear me any better now?
We'll find out in just a second. But while we're dealing with that issue, can you tell us a little bit about this sort of characters as seeds idea?
Sure. So every character, every person is going to be different in their own unique ways. But when observed from the outside by another person, typically that character boils down to 5 or 6 labels your brain has created. So when you see somebody, you may look at them and say gorgeous, you may say fat, you may say tall, you may say ugly, you may say old, you may say athletic, intimidating. There's all these little labels that our brains will generate. And effectively what they're doing is looking to previous experiences that we've had and then sort of riffing off that. So one of the examples that I used recently in an article I wrote, it's about identifying something that somebody already knows and then building on it. If they already have an intimidating character in their life and you describe somebody as intimidating, they're going to back to that. You have to teach them what a grapefruit is. You might start by telling them it's like an orange but bigger. And so anybody who knows what an orange is, they already know about citrus, they already know about a rind, they already know to peel it. All these details come baked in. And so getting back to characters, that's exactly what you want to try to achieve is when you're writing, give them bits of information that will cause them to generate a certain label. So if you show a character being cruel, right off the bat, they're going to think, man, this guy's a dick sock, and I'm going to put that dick sock label on this character.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
I'm allowed to say that.
I'm sure so. Sean says, Nathan is fine. Chris's audio is as if his mic is on the other side of the room. Can just hear. Maybe we can try some earbuds or something like that and try maybe a different microphone and see if that helps. I don't know if that's an option for you.
Microphone number 3.
We'll see if that works. And actually see if we can't fix some of our sound issues. And we'll add captions to this later as well, so people will be able to read along. One of the things that you kind of touched on a little bit about, like, kind of presenting ways for people to understand your characters without necessarily, like, giving them things to relate to. Could you talk a little bit about kind of the idea between tropes and cliches? Like, how do you kind of use something in your writing to describe a character, like you're saying, without it falling into the realm of cliche? I know you bring up cliche a lot. You've been dealing with that because you've been delving into it with your story. But can you talk a little bit about that and how to avoid negative cliches?
Yeah, so a trope is just a simple, bite-sized story cliche. So whenever I say trope, that's all I mean. So maybe you have something that is like Hermione Granger is a know-it-all. Typically what I'll do to soften a character, if you're using a trope like that everybody's going to recognize, is you give the character something unexpected. So, for example, I have a character in my Magitech Chronicles. His name is Sergeant Cruz. He's really large and beefy and scary. He's a drill sergeant, but he loves to cook. And he likes a few other esoteric things like history that have nothing to do with war. You wouldn't expect something like that from him. And so when you see this tough-talking sergeant suddenly start discussing, how to make soup, people find him more relatable. And that, I think, makes people real, because real people aren't stereotypes. We may appear to be that way on the surface, especially during a first meeting, but as you begin to peer a little bit underneath that and get to know people a little bit deeper, you're typically going to see some details that don't line up with that trope. If you tend to give somebody all the same characteristics that are fitting of that, like, you're making them like they're an action hero with no depth, then you're going to run into some sort of, I guess, a disengagement from fans. They're not going to buy into that identity.
Yeah, I can see that for sure. In your book, you also talk about some differences in the way that you view flaws. I know oftentimes we hear about the idea of the hero having this particular character flaw that they're overcoming, but you go into some detail about different ways that you can kind of approach that idea of a flaw. Can you talk a little bit about some of the ways that you've kind of broadened that?
Yeah, so I'm borrowing this from John Truby. He originally broke flaws into categories, which I think is brilliant, and I don't know, for whatever reason, even being a gamer, this never occurred to me to do. But he puts them into separate buckets because there are different types of flaws, and what I've come to learn is different audiences will resonate with different flaws. So you have physical flaws, which are exactly what they sound like. Maybe somebody is disabled physically, maybe they are very young, maybe they are very old, maybe they're just weak and not a very good fighter, they haven't learned yet, and that's important to the setting they're in, but in some way they are limited in what they're able to do, and so they have some sort of perceivable flaw. Like Harry Potter is the example that John uses, and I borrowed from that. Harry Potter is 10 at the beginning of the series, and so he can't make his own dishes because he's just a kid.
Yeah.
there are also mental flaws, and mental flaws are also grouped into psychological flaws. So if you think of the traditional ones, this is really the tropey example: alcoholics, people with drug addictions, people with crippling fears, be it spiders or anything else. Those are all examples of mental flaws. And then finally, he also added the concept of moral flaws. Was the last one. And a moral flaw is something that is perceived to be wrong in the society. So it's hard to say whether something is wrong or isn't wrong. But the question really in terms of whether or not this is a flaw is, would it be perceived as a flaw in the society where the story is taking place? If slavery is totally accepted and this character believes wholeheartedly in slavery, then that's not nearly as much as a flaw as if, we're talking about Gone with the Wind, when everything hinges on the line with the Civil War and your stance on slavery is going to determine everything.
Right. Yeah. And of course, it falls back into your, bottom layer of world building and understanding your world, and keeping that consistent, as you were saying earlier. So I can see how that all fits together. I know that you're a proponent of Dan Harmon's Story Circle, and as I am as well. And how do you kind of incorporate some of those ideas into your character flaw issues and how they sort of evolve as characters throughout your plot?
So Dan Harmon, for those that don't know, is the creator of Rick and Morty and the TV show Community. And these are both short format shows. They're 22-minute episodes. Mm-hmm. And what he's doing is creating a system by which you can have each character grow a little bit in that 22-minute format. So, you've sort of got this abbreviated plot growth. And you can extrapolate that outward on a larger scale, especially if you're looking at the Joseph Campbell source material, that Hero with 1,000 Faces. And the idea is you're taking characters on the same type of journey that has been popular in fiction, going all the way back to the dawn of time for as far back as we have stories. In every society really in the world, there's some form of mythology that harkens back to this. And you're distilling it in the same way. So you're taking a modern retelling of this where you have a character that is coming of age or becoming a hero or whatever your story is. You're going to walk them through this circle, and they're going to have to hit certain notes in the same way. So the story will be different, but they'll hit certain milestones along the way that are going to be familiar, that will resonate with the audience. Mm-hmm. And by the end of it, you'll see the character become someone that they were not in the beginning of the story and are able to solve some sort of story problem that you presented at the beginning. So the example that is most often thrown around is Luke Skywalker at the beginning of Star Wars. No training as a Jedi, no ability to fly an X-Wing, none of that stuff. Right. Goes through all of his trials, descends into the underworld, fights the Empire, rescues the princess, comes back out, blows up the Death Star. Same with the Matrix, where you've got the one Neo in the beginning, where he's coming full circle at the end, and now he can fight those agents. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of your goal with Dan Harmon's Story Circle.
Mm-hmm. How do you apply that towards antagonists?
I tend to give them an identical story circle. The difference is I usually give it a tragic end. Mm-hmm. So you want the hero to be somebody at the end that they were in the beginning. And in the case of the villain, when I say hero, I'm referring to the antagonist. Mm-hmm. This can be they learn a painful lesson. Maybe they live and their whole scheme is destroyed, and either they're angry at the hero, or maybe they turn over a new leaf and they become a hero in their own right. Mm. You get to choose what direction your antagonist is growing in. And ultimately, if you give them a very similar character arc and you have them follow their own story circle, fans will like that antagonist typically a lot more than they otherwise would. You don't have some bland, evil overlord who's doing things for reasons we can't fathom. You see somebody growing and changing, and the things he's doing while evil are happening because that antagonist believes they're the right thing.
Right, and it makes them much more relatable, and instead of being cardboard cutouts of nefarious villains,
twirling the mustache.
Yeah, exactly. For anyone viewing, we welcome comments. Anyone who has specific questions for Chris, especially regarding plot or structure, definitely go ahead and shoot those up in the comments, and we will answer them as best we can. Or if you're watching the replay, I always encourage people to ask questions anyway. Feel free to tag Chris or myself in the comments if you have questions for us. And since a lot of people are watching this replay after it's gone live, please, just feel free to continue to ask those questions, and we'll try to answer them in the comments as best we can. But so we talked a little bit about your characters and your antagonists and things like that. You also talked about sort of the plot structure? You said like the poles of how we shape these characters around the plot. What are some of the key elements of plot that are not necessarily character based? Anything else that you use as part of your structure that's not specifically character based?
There are a lot of different types of structure that you can pick. So if you are writing a romance, for example, you're probably going to want to have a happily ever after. That's a convention of the romance genre. Break that at your own peril. You certainly don't want an axe murderer, bursting at the end and killing a love interest. You want Mr. and Mrs. Right or Mr. and Mr. Right or whatever you're writing to get together at the end. That's the goal of what you're writing. Fans kind of have expectations coming in. And so which structure you're picking really is dependent on your genre. If you're doing science fiction, fantasy, action, adventure, thrillers, you're probably going to go with the hero's journey because that gives you the right plot points that you're trying to hit.
What's your advice? I'm sorry, I kind of lost the connection there just for a second. Didn't hear that you were still continuing. Feel free to continue.
Sure. I was saying if you were writing horror, then you're certainly not required to have a hero's journey. The simple act of surviving can be enough for the character in that. So it's all about knowing what your genre is and hitting the right conventions accordingly.
Gotcha. Quick question. For those authors who are not writing on a specific genre, or they're sort of finding themselves straddling the line of genres, what is your advice for people who are kind of writing cross-genre? Maybe they're just writing a story that they really love to tell, and they're not necessarily, they didn't write it to market, for example. What are some ways for them to kind of still navigate that line? Do you have any advice for them?
I do. All you have to do is figure out the genre that it's closest to, where the fans who pick this book up are going to enjoy it. So if it's people that really like thrillers, my very first series has a werewolf on the cover, which was a terrible mistake because it angles it at horror audiences. And I really should have been aiming at thrillers. So if I had done a different cover, I probably would have saw a lot more traction on that book. So as a cross-genre book, just make sure you know kind of who the audience in question is and try to get the cover to look like that. And then also add whatever elements are present that make it not normally fit in that genre. So that at a glance, readers can say, oh, this is a thriller, but maybe it's got some sci-fi in this way. And so that'll draw their attention.
You also offer, in addition to this book, which I think is fantastic, that you also offer some YouTube videos that kind of accompany this, and then even as we're reading along with the book, I know you're always great at having the reader do exercises and things like that. One of them is points us towards your video series. Can you tell people a little about your video series that goes along with this, and kind of what people can learn from that in addition to the book?
Yeah, what I found is that a lot of readers getting things in one format is not often enough. You need to hear it 2 or 3 different ways and see it in different ways. And so I've recorded a series of videos called How to Plot Your Novel from Scratch that go hand in hand with the book. And you can go check those out, and you can actually see my screen, see Scrivener, download the file if you want, and mess around with it and see how I'm using the system that I'm proposing to write a book. So it gives you that hands-on stuff so you can see my homework assignments to know that, I actually did this work too.
And where's the best place for people to find those videos and that information?
ChrisFoxWrites.com, or you can go to YouTube/ChrisFoxWrites, and that's my channel. We are very proud. We just passed 1 million views on the channel.
Wow, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
And one of the things I wanted to say, I really appreciate how much of a giver you are to the community. I feel like you're one of the authors in the community who has just been so generous with your knowledge and your time and the information that you put out. And all these books are obviously the results of your blood, sweat, and tears and the hard lessons you've learned over the course of various novels you've written. But I personally very much appreciate the way that you share so much of this content in different formats and for all of the rest of the community. And
thank you.
I'm sure many people will, second that. And it's just a lot of content that you provide. It's fantastic. So. I'd love to talk a little bit more in depth. Like you said, you can go into the book and obviously see some of these things, but I'd love to talk a little bit about your sort of scene by scene structure, of kind of how you say you're approaching a scene, like in your outlining. Let's say we're plotting, we're outlining. What are some of the things that do you do individual beats? Like how are you structuring your story before you ever start writing it?
So I would typically write a description of the overall story as best I can.
Okay.
And I'll try to figure out what is this epic ending going to be? What am I building up towards?
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll figure out where my characters start at the beginning of the book, and I'll sort of try to connect the dots. Like, how would they get from where they start to this epic ending that I've crafted?
Okay.
And every decision that I'm making thereon is building on it, where I'll realize, okay, there's got to be more action, so I'm going to have to build some action scenes. What kind of conflict would arise naturally out of the story? And I'll think about my various characters and what they want and how those things can conflict. And then I'll use that to come up with the appropriate scenes. And this harkens back a little bit to genre. The type of scenes that I have are going to flow based on that genre. So if I'm writing something more Michael Bay, I've got lots of explosions, there's all sorts of space battles. I know that going in, and I'm going to have more active, more action scenes. Whereas if I'm writing more of a mystery, I'm going to have more reaction scenes. And then ultimately probably a couple of reveal scenes that are sprinkled throughout the plot. And it's going to be a little bit more introspective, and I'm going to write that accordingly. But really it's examining the story structure as a whole, looking at what you're going for, and then plotting scenes accordingly.
So in advance, are you laying out, okay, I need this many action scenes, but I want to give sort of a reaction scene as a break? Do you sort of go through in advance of writing and think, okay, well, this is a lot of action in a row. I need to maybe try to give the readers a break pacing-wise? How are you doing that?
I tend to do a 3-in-1 ratio, where I'll do like 3 action scenes to a reaction scene.
Okay.
And no more than that. Occasionally I'll go a little bit longer. I go with the rule that I need to make sure I've got some sort of fight or action in the first 5 chapters of the book. Something needs to occur right off the bat because my audience needs to see that. If they don't, then move on.
Right.
But beyond that, a lot of it is very organic.
So you've written a sort of general description of the overall book. You've sort of laid out some of the action versus reaction scenes, and when you're getting into individual chapters, are you a multiple scene per chapter person, or are you a one scene per chapter person? You have a recommendation?
I'm a one scene per chapter person. I do what I call potato chip chapters. I feel like giving natural breaks to the reader allows them to read as much as they want and just stop. So 1,000 to 1,200 words is the length of my typical chapter. They're super short, which fans really seem to like.
Interesting. Okay. And any other tips for pacing? Besides action versus reaction, any other tips you have for pacing your novel?
Yeah, it's about setups and payoffs. You need to make sure that any big payoff that you're putting in the second half of the book is not automatically, but is adequately set up in the first half of the book. So, it's the old adage, if you've got a gun in the first act of a book, it needs to be fired in the third act.
Right.
I try to make sure I'm doing as much of that as possible, and then anything that's not doing that, if I don't have a setup or a payoff, I ask myself the hard question, why is this in the book? How does this contribute to the overall scene? And if there's something that's cool there but isn't really relevant to the plot, can I strip it out and add it to a scene that does address one of these setups or payoffs that are so critical? And then I tend to go with those.
Okay, interesting. What are some of the things that you would say, like if you had there's a lot of books out there on outlining. I was actually in the middle of reading another good book on outlining by Scott King and when I picked up yours. I'm like, well, but I had talked to you and you're like, well, you know what, I'm doing some things a little bit differently here. For those interested in your book, what are some things that you would say that you've done a little bit differently when it comes to outlining in general that is kind of new to the writing space?
I don't know that it's new necessarily. I'm sure that there are some books that have covered this stuff, but I tend to do plot branching. Okay. Which is I'll look at a part of my plot that I think is going to go a certain way, and then I will force myself to envision at least 2 other ways that it could go. Like, what's the worst thing that could possibly happen? And maybe that's the hero gets killed. I mean, I consider some really off-the-wall things. So, like, for example, going back to Star Wars, as I so often do, what if Luke had been killed instead of Obi-Wan when they had been on the Death Star, and how would that have changed the plot?
Ah, interesting. Yeah.
And the act of doing this kind of branching forces me to consider things in such a way that oftentimes I'll come up with changes that'll influence the plot in a very positive way. So a lot of them won't work, but every once in a while you'll hit on a plot branch that'll modify your main plot and make it far better. So that's one of the things that I do. And then the other, I don't know how uncommon this is. I have to imagine a lot of writers do this, but I do now discovery writing, where I'll tend to put in exactly one day on a project as soon as I've got, a very, very rough draft of an outline. just so I can sort of start thinking in that character's voice, and then I'll stop and I won't go back to that for 2, 3, 4 weeks. But during that time, I'll be thinking from the point of view of the character, and because I've done that discovery writing, I'm sort of building that identity in my mind.
Interesting. Yeah. Because you do something which I haven't done too much of. Is most of my series is all in one point of view, one perspective, and I've only got one series where I've got multiple points of view. Do you have any advice for people writing authentic characters in different kind of voices, and how to make sure that while you're structuring this multi-point of view book, that you get them all to sound differently, and make sure that people understand that that's a different character, and how do you approach that?
I do age and upbringing. So how old is this person, and how are they raised? And then I try to look for somebody in my real life that fits that. So I have an aunt who is very fastidious and grew up sort of in high society in New York, like in the 50s and 60s. And so the way that she acts, and the way that she moves, and the way that she speaks, and the way that she does her nails are all radically, radically different from a different lives in and she's got like 17 hummingbird feeders around her property that she loves to go out every day and mess with, and her hair is a frizzy mess. And so I think about each of these people, and then I present the character accordingly to be more like somebody who I'm sort of aiming for. And both of those really arise out of that person's education and their upbringing, how they speak, what words they choose to use. Those are going to vary based on location and education, and gender and, time period. All these things are factors.
That's really interesting. I think that's a great tip. So thank you. Any other tips or tidbits you want to share before we kind of come up on the half hour here? Any other advice for people just starting out, trying to figure out what the advantages are of plotting versus pantsing? Any last minute tips for writers?
Yes, commit to reading 5 books on craft. None of them have to be mine. They can be from anybody that you want. Anything that looks good, just pick 5 and read them. And you don't have to do anything these books say, but if you're at least aware of how story structure works, then you can choose whether to use it or not. And I promise you it won't constrain your creativity. You're still going to be able to write great books. No one's going to force you to write an outline, but that additional knowledge about story structure is invaluable.
I think that's excellent advice. You have to kind of know the rules before you can break them, and it's good to know what you're dealing with. There's a lot behind the scenes, as this episode has revealed. There's a lot that goes into a book and a story structure. It's not just necessarily willy-nilly writing from the seat of your pants, like we said. Chris, thank you so much for your time today. I know you're always very busy, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and chat with us today.
Anytime. I enjoy it. I know you, and I know the other people that frequent the channel, so it's nice to see you guys.
Yeah. All right. And like I said, anyone else who has additional questions for us, if you're watching the replay, feel free to shoot up some questions, tag us in the comments, and we'll be happy to pop back on and answer questions as we can. So thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll see you next week.